A blessed day, a blessed Sabbath after the Purim. I would like to welcome you all from the comfort of your homes so that we enjoy present truth. May I welcome you. As I promised that the topic today is how God then should be worshipped. It's not anyhow. We see from the people who were worshipping in the Old Testament, and also some were worshipping him in the New Testament before the Dark Ages, after Christ had long died. These people showed how our God is worshipped. So the topic is, how is God worshipped? And if we find out how he is worshipped, we will surely concentrate on worshipping God, not on fables, but on the true worship of the living God. So that's my topic for today. The first paragraph we are going to read is from the New Estate, which I saw in the book called S.L.F.H, page 97. So let us read from this book as an introduction to our topic. Let us read from there.
In 1844.
Yeah.
In 1844, after the end of the 2,300 days, years of Daniel 8 verse 14, the restitution of true worship was begun.
Right. So we saw soon after the Dark Ages, then we saw 6 reformers in the Dark Ages. They were reforming the church only to go back to the track where it had lost it from the time Constantine came to invade the Christian church and started also and progressed into the Dark Ages. But God sent reformers, Martin Luther, John Knox, Charles and John Wesley, and Campbell, and William Miller. Then the last reformer was Sister White in 1844. So we are being told by that quotation that in 1844, when Sister White started, it was to restore back what we call the worship of God. So this is where we start from. It says in 1844, after the end of the 2,300 days of Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, the restitution of true worship was begun. It is to continue. This restitution was only begun by Sister White. But in block letters from that court, it says, it is to continue until all things are restored back by antitypical Elijah of Matthew chapter 17, verse 11. Did you hear that? The court does not say it was the restitution of all things of how God is worshipped was done by Sister White only. It says it was begun in 1844 by Sister White, as we know. But it clearly says, read on, it is to, that sentence, yeah?
It is to continue until all things are restored by antitypical Elijah.
Right. It clearly tells us that the prophet who started in 1844 was Sister White, to restore back the restitution, to restore back the worship of the true God. But it does not end with her. It ends by the antitypical Elijah. This is what we get from this book, SLFH, page 97. So the trouble is that many people stopped where Sister White stopped. They did not continue. And they stopped before seeing antitypical Elijah. That's the problem we have. Because it clearly says The restoration of how God is worshipped began in 1844 and continues until the antitypical Elijah comes. You get that sense? So you can't finish and say, since Sister White died in 1915, that's where we are and we continue to be where we are. You have to continue until the antitypical Elijah of Matthew chapter 17 verse 11 comes. Let's go back to the verse itself, Matthew chapter 17 verse 11. Let's see, has God promised an antitypical Elijah?
Matthew 17 verse 11.
Right?
And Jesus answered and said,
Well, maybe let's start with the question. Verse
10.
Verse 10.
And his disciples asked him, saying, Why then say the scribes that Elias must first come?
Right.
And
So the disciples and the scribes knew for sure that Elias was supposed to come. So when they saw John the Baptist, they said, that's the Elias. They were questioning each other. Is that the Elias? So now they had to question Christ and say, has Elias come really? Listen to that question.
And Jesus answered and said unto them,
Right?
Elias truly shall first come and restore all things.
All things.
But I say unto you that Elias is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed.
So they did everything they did to John the Baptist. John the Baptist did not restore everything. What is this everything? What did we lose in the Garden of Eden? The kingdom.
Yeah.
We lost the kingdom of glory. And John the Baptist did not restore the kingdom. Restored everything partially. But the one who restores the full ministry of Elijah comes after Sister White. In that quote where we read that when she started the restitution of the true worship of God in 1844, that was the beginning and was going to end with the visibility of a prophet coming in Elijah's spirit to restore now what we lost from the beginning. And we know we lost the kingdom of glory. That's why we should go back to it before we go to the pelicans, which everyone is thinking that we have to hop in the cloud. But where is the kingdom that we lost? The restoration of all things should be done by the full version of the ministry of Elijah in the time before Christ comes. Because we saw John the Baptist came in a partial spirit of Elijah. But in Malachi chapter 4, go to Malachi chapter 4. Verse 4 to 5.
Verse 4. Remember ye the law of Moses, my servant,
Right?
which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel,
Right.
with the statutes and the judgments.
Right.
Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord.
So, meaning, when John the Baptist came, the law had not yet been changed. The law was still there. There was no dark ages at that time. The Elias who should come to restore the laws that had been trampled by the men of sin in the dark ages. So before that dark ages, John could not restore it because it was already in its rightful place. So there was nothing done to the law because they were still keeping those. The festivals, the commandments was not a problem in the time when Christ came the first time where John the Baptist was. But Christ was predicting now the coming of Elias to restore all things after we had gone through the dark ages, where we see what happened in the dark ages. They changed the times, which are the 10 commandments, and the laws. So, and the festivals. That's what we find. Because that had not yet happened. It had not happened before, when John the Baptist came. It was still future. The changing of the times and laws was still future to John the Baptist. So he couldn't be the full version of the Elias which had been promised in Matthew chapter 17, verse 11. Now you get that point. Let's go back to our court. Our court clearly told us that this reformation, this restitution will continue until all things are restored by antitypical Elijah. Well done, Sister White. Started it in 1844. But we still continue with prophets until Elias comes before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. From that paragraph, that's what we get. Now let's go to another paragraph. ST, November 4. You have to have an app of the new Ellen White Estate. It's so free online. Get it. So that you don't say, where is it? Where is that book? Just go to the book. ST, November 4, 1919. What is 1919? It's soon after Sister White died in 1915. You understand? So that ST was a quote which I have taken from the New Estate. It says, what happens to this? Because we have two laws now on earth. We have the laws that are the festivals in the Bible. And also we have the festivals which came with Constantine, which are called pagan feasts. So these two laws, they stand parallel. So let's hear the new law. Which one is this new law? The one which came with Constantine or the pagan feast? What is it all about? Let's hear about that.
The new law of the man of sin,
right,
has its own spirit.
Listen to that. When you have these pagan feasts, you keep them with a different spirit. The spirit is not together with those who keep the other. Look, I said they are parallel. All of them are called feasts. Pagan feasts and God's feasts. They are all called feasts. But each one has its own spirit. That's why people will ask you, are you keeping Christmas? Yeah? Why are you keeping the Ken meeting in wrong time? Are you keeping? Because they are seeing that spirit is not the spirit which comes together with God's feasts. Because each feast has its own spirit. Now let's hear. The topic is, how is God worshipped? Now let's hear more. The new law.
Right. The new law of the man of sin has its own spirit.
Right.
And its own sacrifice.
Right.
And its own feasts.
Right.
Which have taken the place of those appointed in the law of Moses.
Right. Clear. We have a clear point there, brethren. What happened in the Dark Ages? There was a replacement of the festival. Is it true in the Dark Ages? Let's go to Daniel chapter 7, verse 25 in Good News. Is it true that these ones, the festivals of God, were replaced in the Christian period? Listen to that.
He will speak against the supreme God.
There was somebody in the Dark Ages speaking against the supreme God.
And oppress his people. He would try to change their religious laws and festivals.
So what did he try to change? He substituted the God's feasts, putting his own feasts, which we call pagan. Do you understand? That's what happened in the Dark Ages. Now let's go to the court on ST 4 November 1919. It tells us that the feasts that come with pagan, they come also with another spirit. And those that come with God's feast, they come with another spirit. Right? Let's hear that quote again.
The new law of the man of sin has its own spirit and its own sacrifice and its own feasts,
right,
which have taken the place of those appointed in the law of Moses.
That's what happened. My question is, do you really understand that the God's feasts were replaced by pagan feasts? Then, this quotation is correct. That those came to replace the feasts that were given to Moses. Let's see what Moses being given those feasts. In Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13, I say our topic is, how is our God worshipped? Listen to Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13. Yeah.
Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai,
Right.
and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments,
One,
and true laws,
right?
good statutes,
Statutes.
and commandments.
What are statutes? These are what is called festivals. Is it true that the statutes are festivals? Are the feasts, the new moon, the Passover? Let's go to the new moon in Psalms 81. We want to know if the new moon is called a statute and if it is called a feast. Listen to that.
Psalms
Verse
81.
one.
Verse 1. Sing aloud unto God our strength, and make a joyful noise unto the God of Jacob.
Right?
Take a psalm, and bring hither the timbrel,
Right?
the present harp and the psaltery. Blow up the trumpet in the new moon,
Right?
in the time appointed, on our solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Israel, and a law of the God of Jacob.
He gave it to Israel as a statute, but still it is his law. So, is it true that the new moon is a statute? Is it true that it's a solemn feast? There is no way you can keep the commandments without the statutes. As we saw in Nehemiah chapter 9, Moses got 4 laws. 1, the commandments, which we now know as 10 commandments, and the statutes, which are the new moons, the Passovers. These are the statutes. This is what was given to Moses, and the judgments and the testimonies. Now, that's why we find in Isaiah chapter 66, go to Isaiah chapter 66, you find in Isaiah 66, verse 22, still as we are in heaven and the new earth, continue to keep these statutes. Let's hear.
Verse 22.
Right?
For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord,
Right?
so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another,
Right.
and from one Sabbath to another,
Do you see
shall-
these 2 days? There is no way you can separate them. One, the Sabbath is a 10 commandment. The new moon is a statute. So there is no way you can separate the Sabbath from the new moon. You can't keep the commandments without the statutes. We saw last week when we said the precepts, these statutes were religious precepts given to guard the 10 commandments. There is no way you can keep the 10 commandments without these precepts. Sister White clearly said these are present in our lives as long as life should last. So we see our brethren keeping the 10 commandments without these statutes, which should be there as long as life should last. But we have been told that the complete restoration of all things so that God is worshipped in full will be done by the prophet Elijah before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. The prophet Elijah does all that Matthew chapter 17 verse 11 has promised, that the whole restoration will be brought back by Elijah. So John the Baptist was in a partial state of Elijah, but the full Elijah, full ministry of Elijah comes in the last day before Christ comes in the great and dreadful day of the Lord, to restore everything that the dark ages, men of sin, has taken off and changed. So you can understand now, John lived before the dark ages, but Elijah lives after the dark ages to restore the whole worship of God back to the people. Unto 2,300 days shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Starting in 1844, finishing with Elijah before Christ comes. This is the setup of heaven. Now, we are being told here that this law, the pagan feast, and also the feast of God, they have different laws. That's why when you meet somebody who is still in the law where you find the pagan feasts being kept, they are different from those who keep the laws of God as in the Bible, as given to Moses. So if Moses got these statutes, and then the men of sin went to change them, so that's the job then, which is completely finished and fulfilled by Elijah the prophet in the day before Christ comes. Look at that, brethren. So, if we are being fooled to say Elijah, Sister White was the last prophet, tell them that this court says this message is fully rounded off by the last prophet called Elijah. This is what she says. Elijah shall come to fulfill the whole restoration. It started with Sister White. It ends with Elijah. The Bible says so. Even the spirit of prophecy supports that. So let's not stop where Sister White stopped with the third angel. When Elijah comes, it means for sure the angels have gone further than 3 angels. They've gone even to 5 angels. Before those who are still stuck on the third angel know that Elijah has come. The problem is that we were told that Elias, in Matthew chapter 17, there is a problem with Elias there. When Elias comes, let's go Matthew 17, verse 11, and repeat it. We want to see the problem with Elias. Let's hear it.
And his disciples asked him, saying, Why then say the scribes that Elias must first come?
Right?
And Jesus answered and said unto them, Elias truly shall first come and restore all things.
Right?
But I say unto you that Elias is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him
That's the portion I'm
whatsoever
looking
they
for.
listed.
1, they knew him not. 2,
They done whatsoever.
they did whatever abuse they want to Elias. Exactly what John experienced is what Elias also should do. That's why we find a support of scripture from Sister White talking about the coming of Elias. Go to Sister White 475 testimonies to minister. We find here supporting exactly what they will do then to the Elias of the last. Listen to that.
Prophecy must be fulfilled.
Right?
The Lord says, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Somebody is to come in the spirit and in the power of Elijah.
So that somebody comes in the spirit and power of Elijah. But listen to what happens.
And when he appears, men may say, You are too earnest. You do not interpret the scriptures in the proper way. Let me tell you how to teach your message.
Is that what the Elias of the last one also experiences? Yes. So we saw 2 things with the first Elias, John the Baptist. They never knew him. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Who are these they? The priests who were there at that time, the leaders of the church which was then that time, and all their ecclesiastical authorities. They never knew there was a prophet when John the Baptist was working. They never. We see the Elias, the last one, before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, will have the same properties. The Elias will do things unnoticed. They'll know that Elias is there, but they'll pretend not to see. That's it. And continue with their own fables. Because if these are the laws that are supposed to be preached in the last days, why are they not there in our policies, in our church creeds, in our... They are not there. Why? Because when Elias is on duty, they ignore Elias and continue with their fables. Like what they did in the time of John the Baptist, they never knew him. He finished the whole job while they were ignoring him. Exactly the same. And the other thing, the Bible says they have done what they want with Elias. The Elias of the last day, they also did the same. Cast that Elias out of their church boundaries to fulfill the prophets outside the church. That's what the Elias of the last time should do. If you don't know, don't look for this Elias in the walls of the church. Because the spirit of prophecy and the Bible clearly says when there's an Elijah, it will be outside. They will do what they want with Elias. Prophetically proven and true. Now let's hear this new law, which we said, this new law which comes with the sacrifice and its own feasts, and which have taken the place of the feasts which were given to Moses. Yeah? Let's go there and say in King James, 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 3. Let's hear.
And keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments, and his judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whithersoever thou turnest thyself.
Right. Why should we keep these statutes? Why did God give Moses these statutes? So that they incorporate the worship of God. Why were they given? One, we were told in 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 3, keep these statutes. Keep the charge of the Lord thy God. When you worship God, keep that. So which charge is that? To walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimony. You see, therefore, still according to how Moses was given in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13. These laws are for every way. If there are four, then you are doing the best that any man can do to worship God. He says in verse 3, keep the charge of the Lord thy God to walk in his ways. Which are these ways? It's not only the commandments. The ways are four ways. One, the statutes, which are the festivals, and his commandments, and his judgments, and his testimonies, as given on Mount Sinai. They are called the charge of the Lord. Did you hear that? How do we worship God? By keeping the charge of the law as given in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13 to Moses. When you keep those, this following will happen. Read and finish the whole verse.
And keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses,
Right?
that thou mayest prosper in all
When
that thou
you
doest.
do that, you will prosper in all that thou doest. Did you hear that? This is the law that the devil is trying to make sure you don't keep, so that your living on earth is in vain. Whatever you touch does not prosper. You grow something in the field, it does not prosper. You don't even harvest. You look for a job, it just finishes. You ask for economy, it just waits off. Why? Check how are you worshiping God. 4 things are expected for you to get all the prosperity. It says, keep the charge. You know, there's something that is, there's nothing wasteful as death. I've been listening to news these past days. I've been listening to what was happening everywhere. Some dying with pestilence, some dying with wars, some dying with all sorts of things. But look at who is dying. Then I remember Jeremiah chapter 21, it says, one dies full of strength. The other dies still with milk in the nose. the other, it means that one is very young, a young one. I saw even somebody dying because people think somebody who dies should be a particular person, not everyone. But Jeremiah will tell you that anyone can die. It says anyone can die. Some with after passing degrees, honors, yeah, PhDs. Some after winning a state lottery of millions. People admire that person thinking he's not going to die. Some after marrying and has not even had a first child, they admire what a wedding, but next they hear disaster. Some, when they are sleeping and they've been working so hard in the gym, in everyone, to make sure they keep themselves healthy, but they die. But I have read this verse properly. It says, keep the charge of God. Those follows, their duty is. Let's hear why Moses was given those follows. Go to Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13. Listen to that. Let's hear it. You know, we are rushing nowhere. This is God's day. Let's enjoy present truth, brethren. Let's hear why did God particularly give us such a charge to keep. It was through his mercy and love. But let's hear Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13. There, let's hear.
9 verse 13.
Right.
Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments, and true laws, good statutes, and commandments.
Do you see their follows? Why? Let's go to the next verse.
And madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses thy servant.
So that's why we say the precepts were given to guard the 10 commandments. One, you are keeping the 10 commandments, and you make sure, he made sure he gave the statutes or the festivals so that they guard that you do not mess around with the 10 commandments. So that, why? Listen to that. Next.
Verse 15. And gavest them bread from heaven for their hunger.
Right. Let's see when Moses is giving them to the Israelites. What were the reasons why? Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and see when he's giving what is. Because we read from the Spirit of Prophecy that these laws were to make them prosperous. But when the Bible also to tell us, are they for prosperity? Are they for what? What are the reasons why God gave us to worship him with these statutes, with these commandments, with these judgments and testimonies? Listen to verse 2. Yeah.
Verse 2.
Deuteronomy chapter 6. Yeah. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Moses is taking those laws to the Israelites now after taking them from Mount Sinai. Listen to what happened.
Verse 2. That thou mightest fear the Lord thy God.
They are the ones that cause them to respect God and fear God. Right? Listen to that.
To keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee, thou and thy son, and thy son's son, all the days of the life.
Listen to that.
And that thy days may be prolonged. And that thy days may be prolonged.
Right. These were to prolong their life. Do you see people getting to 100 years, more than 100? In the time of Moses, in the time of Genesis of Adam and Abraham, there was not anyone ahead to live less than 100 years. There was nothing like that. Yeah, there was nothing like that. Do you see what was prolonging their life? 900 years. You hear somebody living 900 years. They had God's charge. They had God's charge. So, if you want a recipe to prolong life, so it means you pass through pestilence and the pestilence won't take you down. Yeah, you contract flu. It's flu. It won't take you down. Why? The recipe is there in the Bible. You pass through wars. It won't take you down. It will just miss you. Why? The recipe to prolong life. You pass through anything, disasters, earthquake, Have you heard planes crashing and then they say there's only one person who was alive? Yes, probably was prolonged. God is prolonging his life. There is a recipe in the Bible to prolong your life. I've read it in the Bible. In the spiritual prophecies there. Why are we so foolish not to follow the recipe? Let's see the recipe. This recipe, it says that your life might be prolonged. Listen to the next one. Right?
Hear therefore, O Israel,
Right.
and observe to do it,
Do it. Do it. Yeah.
that it may be well with thee.
And it's also going to be well with you. You know, you go to families and you find, hey, things are well with you. Everybody says, things are well with you. What is it that you mean? Very healthy, very prosperous, everything is just a very, 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 very everything. You understand? This is what God wants. God does not want to see people suffering. He makes part of their worship to keep the commandments, then they are clean, they have a clear conscience. And also part of their worship to keep these festivals so that it's well with them. They are prosperous, they have prolonged life, they have all these things that they are needing everywhere. People are running here and there. In gym, you see people sweating like that, which is good. But ask them what is the reason. They tell you, I want to live healthy. But yes, that's good. You have done a good thing by exercising. But go and also tackle the statutes in the Bible to increase your will to live healthy. You understand? It doesn't just stop like exercising only or drinking water or eating healthy or whatever. But there's something God has put in the Bible for you to be healthy and prolong life, for you to be preserved alive. What is it that he means? He means surely that all you do is keep what he has prescribed. The statutes, the commandments, the testimonies, the judgments. This is the law that has been passing through Elijah's ministry in the last day before Christ comes. As promised, I will give you Elijah. And Malachi says, somebody, he comes. Elijah comes before the great and dreadful day. But remember that law in Horeb, in Mount Sinai, of the statutes and judgments which people have gone ahead to worship God without these statutes. Put them in your systems, in your creeds, and your whole church will be prosperous. Prosperous. I'll tell you. Why? Because all these laws will bring protection and they bring prosperity to your church. And when they are prosperous, yeah, come whatever comes, it does not stop the prosperity. Even in the lockdown, they are prosperous. Even in time of the war, they are prosperous. Why? There's something protecting them.
Amen.
Do you hear that? Now listen to that.
Hear therefore, O
Hear
Israel,
therefore, O
and
Israel.
observe to do it,
Observe to do these
that
laws,
it may be well with thee,
that it may be well with you.
and that he may increase mightily.
And we also should increase mightily. These laws will make that.
As the Lord God of thy fathers hath promised thee,
This is a promise coming from God, not from Moses.
in the land that floweth with milk and honey.
That's why he took them as a sample out of Egypt, so that they go to the milk and honey. Do you see the milk and honey, which he meant? The statutes, the commandments, the judgments, the testimonies are milk and honey. Anyone who saw them and said, these are drinking milk and honey. You're looking for the proper milk or the proper honey? The honey is in the Bible. The spirit of prophecy, in the Bible, they provided these 4 laws so that when they're walking there, they are blessed. This is what God wanted as a sample. Right? Let's go back to what was the other reason? Go to verse 24.
24.
Of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 24. What is the other reason why he provided these laws?
And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes,
Right?
to fear the Lord our God,
You're supposed to fear God. Yeah.
for our good always,
Right?
that he may preserve us alive,
He also preserves us alive. For it is for our prosperity, our good always. That is the meaning of prosperity.
As
That
it is.
he has to preserve us alive. What else in verse 25? Why should we keep these statutes?
And it shall be our righteousness.
These statutes now give us the seal of the living God. You're looking for the seal? Yeah. I heard someone saying the seal is the Sabbath, which is true, because the Sabbath is the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, which is the Sabbath. Today is the Sabbath. We told you last week that the Sabbath is called Sabbath. It does not have an S. You also need Sabbaths, which are in the festivals. Yeah, we saw in Exodus chapter 31, verse 16, there is a reason why we should keep the Sabbath, which is the Ten Commandments. Let's hear. What is the reason why we should keep the Ten Commandments? Exodus chapter 31, verse 16 to 17. It will tell you clearly why the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments should be kept. But you should also be looking for the Sabbaths, which is the plural with an S, which is not the Ten Commandment Sabbath, but it is the festival Sabbaths. Do you understand? Listen to that. Eh?
Verse 16.
Mm-hmm.
Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations.
You see that Sabbath has no S? It's Sabbath.
Yeah.
If I was a teacher, I would say, "Thi." Don't say "tsi." The Sabbath. Why should we keep that Sabbath?
To observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant.
Why?
It is a sign between
It is
me
a
and
sign.
the children of Israel forever.
Right?
For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and
So
was
you see what
fresh.
sign it is? That he created the heaven and earth and all that in them is for 6 days and rested on Sabbath. So that continues to be a sign. When we are resting today, we are showing that sign that he created heaven and earth. And so we get that blessing. It's a sign between God and us, meaning God is also resting today. We are also resting together with him. But there is a Sabbath with an S. Go to Ezekiel chapter 20. You find that Sabbath with an S. Verse 11. This is not the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments. No. The devil knew that. That's why he sent the men of sin in the dark ages to tamper with the Sabbath and the Sabbaths. Now listen to that. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 11 and 12. Yeah.
And I gave them my statutes,
Right?
and shewed them my judgments.
We were talking about the statutes and judgment which are now sent with Elijah the prophet, which also came from Mount Sinai. Statutes and judgments. He's not talking about the Ten Commandments on that verse. He's talking about statutes and judgments. So don't pull that verse and put it to the Ten Commandments. It is on the festivals. Listen, the statute is a festival. It's a feast, the new moon, the Passover, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacle, and the correct date. These are the statutes that God is now talking about in Ezekiel 20. But let's hear. I gave them my statutes and my judgments. And what?
Which if a man do,
Yeah?
he shall even live in them. Moreover also, I gave them my Sabbaths.
Right. Did you see that the Sabbath is Sabbaths? Those are found in the statutes, in the festivals. That's why we say the camp meeting. If you go to Leviticus chapter 23 on the camp meeting verse, that will tell you that the camp meeting goes for 8 days. The first day is a Sabbath. The last day is a Sabbath, and including the 7th day Sabbath, which comes in the middle. So that's where we now find what is called the Sabbaths with an S. Do you understand that? But don't pull Ezekiel chapter 20 and think God is talking about the Ten Commandments. He's not talking about Ten Commandments. In verse 11, it clearly says, is the statutes and judgments, and they come with Sabbaths. Let's remember that. Now, First Kings chapter 2 verse 3 has clearly told us that keep the charge of the Lord. Go back to the verse I gave you. Keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments, and his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whithersoever thou turnest thyself. So it means when you are keeping these four laws, whithersoever you go, you still be prosperous. Yeah? Some, when they go to Gokwe, they are prosperous. When they go to Binga, they are prosperous. As long as those four laws are there. They go to UK, they go to America, as long as that four law is with you, you will be prosperous. That's what God is saying there. Wherever thou turnest yourself to go, you will have those four laws. Right? Let's hear. Somebody will say, these were nailed to the cross. Now we just need God and God alone. In Jesus, in Jesus, in Jesus. That they call the name several times like that and think that's what God is expecting. God is expecting something. Let's go another estate. Again. ST February 3, 1888. Paragraph 5. You have your new estate. Go to it. Go to it and let's read together. In these last days. Yeah.
In these last days, there is a call from heaven inviting you to keep the statutes and ordinances of the Lord.
Finish. Spirit of prophecy that we follow. The estate, ST February 3, 1888, clearly to those who have ears, says, in these last days, there is a call. Who is calling for that call? In the last days. Not in the Old Testament. Not in the time of the men of sin. Not in 1844. 1844, there was a call to start reformation. And she started. Sister White started with the 10 Commandments. But we have been told she ends, even when she dies, the prophet of the hour in the last days should be concluding the whole restitution. But what is it that comes in the last day with the prophet Elijah? It says, in these last days, there is a call. If there is a call, there is a prophet. The call, God does not make a call with anybody except the prophet. Amos 3 verse 7 tells you, does not do anything unless he gives the information to the prophet of the hour. It says, in these last days, there is a call from heaven. It's God himself calling, inviting you to keep the statutes and ordinances of the Lord. In these last days, not somewhere. You see people diverting you and telling you that they were nailed to the cross. Give them this ST February 3 and 1880. If people have come up to say, I'll stand by the Lord and keep the feast, don't think they are cuckoo or they are mad or something. It's because of the call. There is a call from heaven, not from anywhere else, but from heaven to call those who want to worship God properly. A call to keep the statutes and ordinances of the Lord. Of course, there are people who, they are the drawbacks who always don't want a change. Let them remain with the third angel's message. But the call is not in the third angel's message. The call is in the last days. In the last days, it says, the world, listen to that.
The world has set at naught the law of God.
Wait there. Whoever is rejecting the statutes or the festivals, the spirit of prophecy clearly calls that person a world. Because it says, the world won't accept the statutes. The world has set at naught the law of Jehovah. Did you hear that? But God, listen to the next sentence. Yeah.
The world has set at naught the law of Jehovah, but God will not be left without a witness to his righteousness,
Right.
or without a people in the earth to proclaim his truth.
Even if the world and those who are eating their own bread, like in Isaiah chapter 4, it says 7 women are eating their own bread. They are rejecting the call to keep these festivals or the statutes. Even if they reject, God will not be left without a witness to his righteousness. So this law we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 25, it says, this is your righteousness. That's why we keep the statutes. It's our righteousness. So God is left without a witness to his righteousness. Or without, listen to that, or without a people.
Or without a people in the earth to proclaim his truth.
Or without, even if you block yourself and say we are in the third and we finish, we are ready to go up in the cloud, God will not be left with people who will come up and say we will declare it. Even if you seal your churches, we will declare these statutes. God will have a people. He will not remain. It says clearly that the world is set not at the law of Jehovah. But God will not be left without a witness to his righteousness, or without a people in the earth to proclaim his truth. The door of the, listen to that door, listen to that.
The door of the heavenly sanctuary has been opened.
The door to this truth, brethren, whether you like it or not, he says when he opens, no man shuts that door. He has opened the door for Elijah, the prophet of the last hour, to bring these statutes. Whether we can disfellowship people, they will still bring the statutes to the people. And the people will one by one take up their cross. One by one. Those who are counted, already God knows the number which is supposed to be saved. Already God knows the names which is supposed to be saved. They will respond. Because the door has been opened for the statutes to be brought back. Because even if the men of sin in Dark Ages 538 AD and 1798 AD can block them there, but they are still coming up with the Reformation. Until Elijah the last will bring all things, restore all things, and enter the pearly gates, the kingdom, restore the Garden of Eden as it was, the throne of glory. Now, here, the door of the heaven, read on, let's hear.
The door of the heavenly sanctuary has been opened, and no man can shut it, and the light of the Holy of Holies is shining into the world.
What Christ went into the Holy of Holies to do was to make sure he works together with all the prophets, starting in 1844. Why 1844? The 2,300 days expired in 1844. To make sure I appoint Sister White to bring this light of restitution of how God is worshipped, and ends with Elijah before he comes. What are all these prophets doing? They are bringing the worship of God, which is true, which the men of sin was trying to, change and disguise people. And people now, after Dark Ages, they are miserable because they do not know the proper worship of God. But only when they go under the banner where God is working with the prophets, bringing these statutes and judgments to the people, then they are saved. You understand that? Now let's hear more. The people of God.
The people of God have had their attention called to the Ark of the Testimony, and the law within it has been revealed with its unutterable precepts.
The law within the Ark was these four laws. I hear people saying it's just the 10 Commandments which is in the Ark. You don't know. You don't know. If you don't know, just close your mouth. 4 laws. And the last one, which had been rejected, the statutes and judgment, he brings them back with Elijah the prophet to make sure there are 4 that will make men to be rescued and translated back to the pearly gates. 4 laws. You understand? So here we have seen how in its ST February 3, those who want to reiterate and check and make sure there are no doubts, and go up to it and read ST 3, 1888, page 5. But let's go another one. Let's see another one. because we are not saved with only one chord. That's why we are here to enjoy present truth of the true worship of God. But let's go to SS 376.4, and then we go also SS 77.1, right? The nations.
The nations of the saved will know no other law than the law of heaven.
Right. So what do we call the law of heaven? Those 4 laws. They are called the laws of heaven. The nations of the saved will know no other law than the law of heaven. The statutes, they dominate heaven. The judgments, 10 commandments, all those testimonies, they dominate heaven. This is what is called the law of heaven. But let's hear more.
All will be happy and united family.
This will make us happy and united. Because when you see in Malachi chapter 4, verse 4 to 5 and 4 to 6, you find that these laws will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. These laws will unite the family. They are uniting. They unite you, brethren to brethren, and also brethren to the fathers in heaven. We are like an inseparable family because of these laws. The law of heaven, the nations of the saved. When we are saved, there will be so many nations. I told you we have 12 planets, and the only planet which did not have these statutes, which messed around with these statutes, is the planet Earth. The rest of the 11 planets, they are keeping these 4 laws. Now, when we are saved, the nations of the saved will know no other law than the law of heaven. Listen to that. And all will be happy and united. Listen to that. Next verse, next sentence.
The morning stars will sing together, and the sons of God will shout for joy, while God and Christ will unite in proclaiming, there shall be no more sin, neither shall there be death, or neither shall be any more death.
Right? What will be happening there? Listen.
From new moon to new
From
moon.
new moon to new moon, the nations which are saved. From new moon to new moon.
And from Sabbath to Sabbath.
And from Sabbath to Sabbath.
All flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord.
What about Passover? What about Pentecost? What about Feast of Tabernacle? All these statutes will unite the nations together with God. And he says God will also join in the singing when they are singing for him, these nations, in the new heaven and the new earth. All the nations of the saved, this is what will have over them. There is no more pagan feast, nothing. They all talk one language with these statutes and judgments and commandments and testimony. This will dominate the nations of the saved. They will all be united. And when they are singing, we have been told, when they shall sing, the morning stars will sing together, and the sons of God will shout for joy, while God and Christ will unite also in proclaiming the statutes and judgments. Hey, brethren, we are entering heaven. We have been given the cake of heaven, and it comes through Elijah the prophet. Let those who shun God's feasts and who want to occupy themselves with man-made feasts, but those who will unite with God, they won't only sing alone. They will sing together with Christ. They will sing together with God. They will proclaim the statutes together with heaven. Do you understand? Now let's hear. From one new moon to the next new moon, from one Sabbath to the next Sabbath, all flesh shall worship him before me, says the Lord. Why should we go several days in front of him on these statutes? Because that's what God wants. This is his worship. When we are united on the new moon, we are worshiping together with other nations of the saved. those who did not even test sin. And even we are worshiping together with the heaven, together with the God and the Christ and the whole universe of the angels. They are there on the new moon. They are there on the Passover. They are there on the Pentecost and the Feast of Tabernacles with proper time. On the 15th day, next month, which is April. Yeah, being a Friday night, Lord's Supper. That's an appointed time in heaven where they are all seeing what happened to Christ at the cross. We will celebrate the Passover. Yeah. So this is marking the nations of the saved will be together. And also God and Christ and all the universe in heaven will be together. This unites the family. From one, finish that paragraph, from one new moon to another.
From new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord.
Right?
For the Lord will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places, and will make her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord.
This comes only when we are keeping all the four laws. This is what we'll be doing in the new heaven and the new earth. So when do we practice that? God says this should be practiced on earth while we are waiting for Christ to come. It will qualify us to be part of heaven and the new earth. This will qualify us. But how do we start? Elijah the prophet has been sent before the great and dreadful day to educate everybody. You see, when they are struggling to say, Lord, 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 like it is in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Not everyone is saying, Lord, Lord. But those who are in the pattern of the heavenly universe above, united with the nations of the saved, these are the ones who will be qualified to go and take this space which was left vacant by Lucifer when he sinned with 1/3 of the angels. It's not everyone. You will find when you see people are around you who have nothing to do with God's feast, don't be worried, because it's not everyone. It clearly says 1/3 will be taken and put into fire. What fire? Of people shunning you for these feasts, because you have this heavenly spirit of keeping these feasts, while others have a pagan spirit of keeping the other feasts. Do you understand? There are two. That's why I say in one family, when that happens in Luke, it tells us clearly that the fire has been thrown. From henceforth, 5 in the family will be divided. 2 with God's feast, 3 with pagan. They won't meet. This is what the Bible says. Thus, God prepares his own and puts the seal on his own. Now let's hear more evidence. What more evidence? That how God should be worshipped. You see God being worshipped. People, today is the Sabbath, the Sabbath, but you don't find them on the new moon. You don't find them on the Passover. You don't find them. Then you are perplexed to say, where are they heading to? Right. So let's hear another quote. I'll give you another one, the one that we know. Yeah, because the person we follow is Christ. But let's see how he conducted himself in Desire of Ages, my favorite book. Desire of Ages, page 75, first paragraph and second paragraph. Want to see how Christ, who came to be a pattern for us on earth, was raised. Was he raised keeping these statutes, these feasts? Was he? We want to understand, what was it? Right, let's go to among the Jews, yeah.
Among the Jews, the 12th year was the dividing line between childhood and youth.
So you see, in the time among the Jews, we are being clearly told in the time of Christ, when you were 12 years, you are now adult. That's when they started, some others are baptizing people after 12 years. They say now is in a deciding age. So now we see other places, we see somebody is an adult after 16 years, someone is an adult after 18, so different age groups. But in that time when Christ came, it was 12 years. Now, this is what we read from Desire of Ages, page 75. first paragraph. Now let's hear.
Among the Jews, the 12th year was the dividing line between childhood and youth. On completing this year, a Hebrew boy was called a son of the law and also a son of God. He was given special opportunities for religious instruction and was accepted to participate in the sacred feasts and observances.
Right. Listen to that.
It was in accordance.
Listen to that. In that age, when you are 12 years, then you are supposed to now be called a son of the law. So it means all the laws will be expected from a 12-year-old. 12 years. Supposed to be a keeper of the law. Right? So, you were supposed now to start keeping the feasts. So we say, we want to see how Christ was raised. Now Christ is 12 years. We want to see, now he's supposed to be a law keeper and also was supposed to keep the festivals. Listen to that.
It was in accordance with this custom that Jesus in his boyhood made the Passover visit to Jerusalem.
Right?
Like all
So,
devout...
because that custom was still intact and binding, so Christ knew now he was 12 years. And he also went to Jerusalem to follow the law. It says in Deuteronomy 16, verse 16, 3 times a year. Because Christ lived in Nazareth. Nazareth and Jerusalem are miles apart. But he knew Deuteronomy 16, verse 16 says 3 times a year, you will keep a feast in Jerusalem. That's why we see Christ going now to Jerusalem when he turned 12 years. Do you understand? Now let's hear.
Like all devout Israelites, Joseph and Mary went up every year to attend the Passover.
Right?
And when...
all the devout, do you see that? All the pious people in Israel, that's what they did. That's what we are being told by Sister White. Mary and Joseph went up every year to attend the Passover. And listen to that. And when? Right.
And when Jesus had reached the required age, they took him with them.
They now took him to Jerusalem on Passover. Why? He had reached the required age of 12 years. Right? Let's see.
There were 3 annual feasts: the Passover,
1,
the Pentecost,
2,
and the Feast of Tabernacles,
3.
at which all the men of Israel were commanded to appear before the Lord at Jerusalem.
Right. Is it what was happening in the time of Christ? Is it what was his life in the worshiping of God? Yes. This is how Christ and his family, Mary and Joseph, they were going 3 times a year on Passover, on Pentecost, on Feast of Tabernacles. That's why that law was not nailed to the cross, because 50 days after Christ had long gone, we see the Christians in Acts chapter 2, verse 1. Let's see Acts chapter 2, verse 1. The Christians still observing the Passover. Listen to that.
Verse 1.
Acts chapter 2, verse 1. Yeah.
And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place.
Right.
And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind.
So they came together on the day called Pentecost, which is a feast, a statute. But where were they coming from? Verse 5.
And they were dwelling at Jerusalem, Jews, devout men, out of every nation under heaven.
Right. Do you see that they had come from all nations at that time in the Christian era? In the time of the New Testament, they had actually came from all countries under heaven to worship God in Jerusalem. I said my topic is, how is God worshipped? How is it that brings the Holy Ghost? That brought the Holy Ghost on the day of Pentecost. Why was it particularly on that day? Because it was the time of a statute. Did you understand? Now, someone would say, no. Christ was in the custom of the Jews. Let's see the disciples. They were now under Christ. And they were called Christians.
Yeah.
They were not, they had finished the Old Testament. They are now in the Christian era. Let's read from LP. It's not a book. You just Google it. LP 118.1. Let's see whether these were also keeping these statutes. Let alone commandments, they have no arguments. Everyone is saying they are keeping commandments. But we want the statute bit, these precepts that bring all these blessings that we have seen. Were the early Christians, were the people who followed Christ keeping these statutes? Now let's hear, after leaving Corinth.
After leaving Corinth,
Mhm.
Paul's next scene of labor was at Ephesus.
Right?
He was on his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the approaching festival.
Finish.
And his
some
stay
some
at-
will tell you that I follow Paul. Paul is the preacher of the Gentiles. Correct? But look at the leader, Paul. We saw Christ himself with his parents 3 times a year going to Jerusalem from Nazareth. I've been to Nazareth myself and I've seen it's a long travel journey from Jerusalem. He had to take that journey to Jerusalem 3 times a year with his parents. Now, someone say, okay, it was Christ, you are still in the custom of the Jews and this and that. Now here we have the early Christians who are now demonstrating how we continue keeping these statutes after Christ had long gone. This is Paul. Paul says, after leaving Corinth, Paul's next scene of labor was at Ephesus. He was on his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the approaching festival. And his stay at Ephesus was necessarily brief. But he was on his way to celebrate the approaching festival. Was Paul also in the law in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16? Let's see this law, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16. Is it commanding people to worship God in the true worship of God in Jerusalem 3 times a year? Listen to that.
3 times in a year
Right.
shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose,
What?
in the feast of unleavened bread,
Which is the Passover,
and in the feast of weeks,
which is the Pentecost,
and in the feast of tabernacles,
which is the camp meeting.
and they shall not appear before the Lord empty.
Someone will ask you and say, where do we find this money to go 3 times a year? Oh, that's your second tithe. If you mess around with it and send it anywhere else, but it's clear in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22, it is the one for the festivals. It's for you to carry to the place where God has mentioned to go. Right. Then he says, he mentioned somewhere and put his name. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 6. 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 6. Where did he put his name?
Verse 6.
Verse 6.
But I have chosen Jerusalem,
Did you see?
that my name might be there,
Right?
and have chosen David to be over my people Israel.
Right. So he has chosen where? Jerusalem. He just told you, I chose Jerusalem. He says 3 times a year, go there and worship God on the feast of Passover, on the feast of weeks, which is the Pentecost, on the feast of tabernacles, which is the camp meeting. We saw Christ in the book Desire of Ages, page 75 and 75.1 and .2, clearly going and keeping this feast 3 times a year with his family, Mary and Joseph. That's our example. But someone will say, okay, we want Paul, who is the preacher of the Gentiles. We saw that in LP 118.1, after leaving Corinth, Paul's next scene of labor was at Ephesus. He was on his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the approaching festival. Paul still keeping the law which came from Deuteronomy 16, verse 16, is still with the law as it is with Christ, was still with the law 3 times a year, where it was coming from the Old Testament to the New Testament. This is how God was worshipped throughout the whole Bible. Now, let us see another exposition. Let's go to the Bible now in Acts chapter 18, verse 21. We want to see whether this law of keeping the festivals is still with us in the New Testament. Both the Bible and the Spirit of prophecy should help us to come up with the true worship of our living God. Listen to that.
But bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus.
This is what we saw, that book, LP 118. Someone say, I don't have that book, so I have no evidence. Go to this Bible. In Acts chapter 18, verse 21, tells you what Paul is telling the believers there. I must by all means keep this feast that cometh. So, if he was not a feast keeper, he could have said, no, I'm on a mission in Ephesus. I will preach right through. And he could have demonstrated that the feasts were not important. But even if he was on a mission to preach, when the time of the feast came, he went to Jerusalem. So that was a continuation of that law of Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16, where God blessed his name, he went back to Jerusalem. But let's hear more. Let's hear more. Go to Acts chapter 20, verse 16.
For Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus, because he would not spend that time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost.
Listen to the next feast. The first one was the Passover. And the Passover is barely 50 days. From the Passover feast, it's 7 weeks. Remember in Leviticus chapter 23. 7 weeks, which gives us 49. And then the next day after the Sabbath, which is the 50th day, that's the day of Pentecost. 50, he had to go back to Asia. And also hastened to go back to Jerusalem on the Pentecost. Do you see? He was also doing the same that Christ and his parents were doing. Do you see that? But let's hear. Let's hear. Let's go again to the Spirit of prophecy. Because these two, they should also tally. They work together. Now, let's go to Acts of the Apostles, page 392, first paragraph.
But
what happened? But upon considering...
But upon consideration, he determined to hasten on, for he desired, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. On arriving at Miletus, however, about 30 miles from Ephesus, he learnt that it might be possible to communicate with the church before the ship should sail.
This is the year to board a ship. Like it is now your boarding planes to go 3 times a day. Look, these had no fastest machine. The ship is not as fast as the plane. But they made sure, even when they're sailing, they would sail those several days only to catch the feast in Jerusalem. Now you have got, in 5 years where I'm here, it's still 5 hours you are in there. You are in Jerusalem. 5 hours barely. What excuse do you have? Someone was sailing. Good. You can ask those who have been sailing. How many nights and how many days and nights you spend on the ship? Sailing only. Just to make sure the law of God is kept. Now, let's hear more. 389, Acts of the Apostles. First paragraph.
Paul greatly desired to reach Jerusalem before the Passover, as he would... Paul greatly desired to reach Jerusalem before the Passover, as he would thus have an opportunity to meet those who should come from all parts of the world to attend the feast.
So what was he going to meet when he went there? You see, this now is the Passover.
Yeah.
We have seen it keeping the Pentecost, the Passover. He was hastening to call for the Passover, for he is going to meet all coming from different parts of the world. So you see, in the time of Paul, People still were going from different parts of the. You tell me that Paul was working in the Old Testament time, then it's how very, very dull you become. Paul was working in the Christian era. Go and tell them that tell you that these feasts were nailed to the cross. That Paul was living after the cross, sailing at Passover, sailing at Pentecost, sailing at Tabernacle. For somebody will tell you that Christ was going 3 times a year because he was from Nazareth, which is within Israel, so there was no problem with traveling. But we have seen Paul. We had to board a ship from outside Israel to keep the feast 3 times a year in Jerusalem. So what is it that you can produce to God as your own excuse, which only pertain to you only and you alone, which other believers do not, find it very easy to keep those. They find it very easy to keep those laws of how God is truly worshipped, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. What argument do you have? Now let's hear in 390 Acts of the Apostles, still the same, 390.2.
Upon receiving warning of the plot, Paul decided to go around the way of Macedonia. His plan to reach Jerusalem in time for the Passover services had to be given up, but he hoped to be there at Pentecost.
So we want to know why he gave up the plan to be in Jerusalem, like it was with us. There was locked down for almost 2 years. No plane, no nothing. Even if you want to jump, you can't jump through the Mediterranean Sea and sail until Jerusalem, or you can't, because there's no ship, there's no plane. So God couldn't excuse you better, because at least in your home, make sure it is a feast of Passover. It is a feast of Pentecost. It is a feast of. But when the planes are now traveling backwards and front backwards, what is it that you tell God that I can't do it because of this? What is it? Here we are being told Paul had to cancel that trip and kept it still with the people of Philippians. Why he cancelled? Let's hear the reason. It will come out. Let's go to also Acts chapter 20, verse 4 to 5, and then verse 7. Let's hear.
And they accompanied him into Asia, Sopater and Berea. And
You are not reading properly. Read again.
And there accompanied him into Asia, Sopater and Berea.
Of Berea.
And of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Scudias, and Goes and Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. These going before tarried for us at Troas.
Verse 7.
And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight.
Right. So you see, he was preaching on the first day of the week, right? On the first day of the feast. Right. Let's see. Let's hear 390.4 Acts of the Apostles.
At Philippi, Paul tarried to keep the Passover.
Right.
Only Luke remained with him. The other members of the company passing on to Troas to await him there. The Philippians were the most loving and true-hearted of the apostles' converts. And during the 8 days of the feast, he enjoyed peaceful and happy communion with them.
So you see now, Paul, even if he did not go to Jerusalem, he kept the feast with the Philippians. We have seen the list of names of the people that were keeping that feast with him, even if he did not go to Jerusalem. So now, are you seeing the reason why he did not go to Jerusalem? What was it? there were so many people who were so receptive of the message. And for him to leave them at that very moment, it meant these people, they needed the message of the feast terribly. Otherwise, if you are saying the feasts were not there in the New Testament, we could be querying then, what was the job of the disciples? What were they teaching people? They were teaching people to observe God's charge, which we hear that the charge was the 4 laws. This is why Paul kept the feast there. Let's go to Acts chapter 27, verse 9.
We spent a long time there until it became dangerous to continue the voyage. For by now, the Day of Atonement was already past. So Paul gave them this advice.
Listen to that. Now, the Day of Atonement was a feast, is a feast until today. But it says, because it was dangerous to continue the voyage, so they remained to keep the Day of Atonement because they can't reach Jerusalem. Now let's hear another exposition from another quotation. Go to the New Eastern. It says GC 88 689.4. Why I gave this one, I want you to know now, since the early Christian church was keeping these feasts, to show that this is what God truly wants. So then what happened? We continue to say, Daniel 7, verse 25, the men of sin change in the dark ages, the men of sin this and this. Let's see another person now coming to invade the system of worshiping God. We know this person so well, but we want the scripture to identify this person changing now, dominating, introducing the pagan feast in the early Christian church. Peradventure, those people who are telling you that they were nailed to the cross, they do not know this bit, how these feasts were changed in the Christian time. Right, let's hear from that topic. GC 88 space 685.4. Right, start.
Constantine.
Yeah.
Constantine began very early to demand obedience from all the churches.
Yes, he introduced something else. And he comes to the church saying, now, instead of those feasts, this is what we're supposed to keep. Very early in the Christian era, right? But yet, listen, of this,
the dispute between the Eastern and the Western churches respecting Easter is a striking illustration.
So the people here had taught the East and the West, they were now worshipping differently. Some were, instead of Passover, were worshipping
Easter,
keeping Easter instead of Passover. But who is teaching? There's somebody teaching them now, right? Listen to that. This dispute
arose in the 2nd century.
At the time is the 2nd century when these feasts were being changed. You see them being introduced. Now we have the East, they are now keeping Easter. And the West, the churches in the West are still on the Passover. But now Constantine began very early to make sure they all keep the pagan feasts as those who were in the East. Listen to that. Right?
Says Moshe.
Just start with this dispute.
Okay. This dispute arose in the 2nd century.
Right?
Says Moshe. The Christians of this century celebrated anniversary festivals in commemoration of the death and resurrection of Christ.
We are finding this in the book GC 88 space 685.4. You see, at that time, when Constantine came, the Christians were still keeping the festivals in accordance with the Bible. And that's why it says the Christians of the century celebrated anniversary festivals in commemoration of the death and resurrection of Christ. At that time, they were still keeping. It's 538 and 1798. AD. It's the second century, which is in the New Testament. Right? Let's hear.
The day which was observed as the anniversary of Christ's death was called the Paschal Day or Passover.
Right. The day they were celebrating the death of Christ, that is the Lord's Supper. This day was called Passover in the time of the Christian era. Right? Listen to that.
Like the Jews, Christians celebrated a sacred feast.
They were celebrating this sacred feast like the feast which is celebrated by the Jews.
At which
Passover. That's why on Passover day, you have to check to see, are they on Passover? That is the time. Right? Listen to that.
Like the Jews, Christians celebrated a sacred feast at which they distributed a Paschal lamb in memory of the Holy Supper.
Like the Jews were doing that Paschal lamb. But with us, we were not taking Paschal lamb. What were we taking? Bread and wine as instituted by God. Listen to that.
The Christians of Asia Minor, kept this feast on the 14th day of the first Jewish month.
That bread and wine was taken on the 14th day of Abib, as it was. But the Jews, when on that day they were killing the lamb. But the Christians were taking bread and wine on the 14th day at even, like it was with the Jews. At even, as it was in Leviticus 23. Right? Listen to that.
The Christians of Asia Minor kept this feast on the 14th day of the first Jewish month.
Right?
When the Jews celebrated their Passover and when Christ is said to have eaten the Paschal lamb with the disciples.
Right.
3 days thereafter, a festival was observed in honor of the resurrection. The Western churches, on the other hand, celebrated the resurrection of Christ on the Sunday following the Jewish Passover and observed the Paschal feast on the night preceding Sunday, thus connecting the commemoration of Christ's death with that of his resurrection.
Right? So you see, this is GC 88 space 685.4. You need that history. You need that history. When people stand and say, they're done away, they're done away. This was happening in the time of Constantine. Right? Let's go to the other quotation. 88 GC, same GC, 88 space 686, first paragraph. This is what I want. Yeah. Toward the conclusion.
Right. Towards the conclusion of this, the second century, Victor endeavored to force the Asiatic Christians by the pretended authority of his laws and decrees.
He brought this man called Victor, succeeding Constantine. He brought a decree. Yeah, like it was when we saw in Purim, Haman brought a decree to ban these laws. But here in the Christian era, Victor brought this decree to the Christians. Listen to that. Listen to that.
Victor endeavored to force the Asiatic Christians by the pretended authority of his laws and decrees to follow the rule which was observed by the Western churches in this point. Accordingly, he wrote an imperious letter to the Asiatic prelates, commanding them to imitate the example of the Western Christians with respect to the time of celebrating the festival of Easter. The Asiatics answered this lordly requisition with great spirit and resolution, that they would by no means depart in this manner from the custom handed down to them by their ancestors. Upon this, the thunder of excommunication began to roar.
Right. So they are now introducing those pagans to the Christians. And there are some who are staunch to say, we will never, come what may, we will never change the worship of God. Then what happened when they said so? There is the beginning of what we call disfellowshment. They're now supposed to be disfellowshipped for keeping what God has given in the Bible. They're supposed to also follow suit and keep these pagans on the west side. This Victor was the one who wrote those letters. Listen to that.
Victor, exasperated by this resolute answer of the Asiatic bishops, broke communion with them, pronounced them unworthy of the name of his brethren, and excluded them from all fellowship with the church.
Right. So you see, this is how people started to be disfellowshipped from the 12th century. If anyone is disfellowshipped from any biblical point, this is still the same spirit. They disfellowship from so that you stop worshiping God. This is in GC 88, 686.1. So people were starting now to be disfellowshipped when they refused to keep Easter and they kept Passover. That's what happened. This is the book. Read it for yourself. Now, let's go to GC 88 space 686.2. Buy these scriptures when they are still freely available. For the devil, the enemy, is very cunning. Once he sees you touching all these things that he has kept obscure so that nobody will read, you start also blocking them. Now, for a time, listen to that.
For a time, however, Victor's efforts availed little. No regard was paid to his letters, and the Asiatics continued to follow their ancient practice. But by enlisting the support of the imperial power, with the church for so many centuries controlled to serve her purposes, the church finally conquered. The Council of Nice, out of complaisance to the Constantine the Great, ordered the solemnity of Easter to be kept everywhere on the same day, after the custom of the church.
Right, leave it there. So you see now there is a council which has been appointed, Council of Nice, which is under Constantine, to compel people. Otherwise, when you are telling me that there was persecution, why do you think they were persecuted? Yeah? For the 10 Commandments only. For the festivals. They were persecuted from... You talk about the feast being nailed to the cross. When at the time of persecution in Dark Ages, where they were the main reason why people were being persecuted. Right. So let's go to what were they in fulfillment to? There is a verse in Hosea chapter 2. You start at verse 9. Hosea chapter 2, go to the east and start in verse Hosea 2. God had predicted all this to happen. You remember, first it was the Israelites when they were in Canaan. He had predicted that they will stop keeping feasts. So now in our time, the prediction also was pointing to a double period. The first period was them in Babylon. And then the second period when we were under the Dark Ages, where the feasts were being prohibited. And also when they went to Babylon, the feast had been darkened. Do you understand? But let's see the verse which was prophesying these two periods. Go to Hosea 2, verse 9 to 11.
Therefore will I return and take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and will recover my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. And now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of mine hand. I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her solemn feasts.
So God was angry with this church by then, in the Old Testament, and said, because I'm angry with you, you are profaning my statutes. You remember when we read Ezekiel chapter 20, the main reason why God sent them to to Babylon is because they were already not keeping the statutes. They were offending him, you know. So because of that, God promised that I will now go, you know, read the last bit. I want that they will cease their feast.
I will cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her
Right.
new moons,
Right?
and her Sabbaths and all her solemn feasts.
Do you see how they were caused to stop keeping the feasts because God was angry with them? He sent them to Babylon in the Old Testament so that the mouth of that prophecy of Hosea 2 verse 9 to 11 should be fulfilled, that when they are there, they won't keep the feast. They won't keep all that because they had offended God. And the double prediction went to our time of the early Christian. The early Christians, when this man stood up to now divert the worship of God, we clearly went into dark ages. And we can see where now this man Victor and whatever were causing people not to keep the Passover, not to keep all these feasts, and people were being threatened with excommunication, disfellowship, which also later on advanced into persecution. Just these festivals. So if you hear men in front of you who claim to lead you into the pearly gates, telling you that these festivals have been nailed to the cross, you know for sure where they are taking this spirit from. It started in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, where their feasts stopped when they were in Babylon. And it also, in our time, it went to the dark ages, where we see the early Christian churches being threatened with excommunication. They should follow. They should, all the feasts that came from Constantine, they should all take them. And then now when Sister White says, resumes the restoration of those times, we still hear a people telling you and me to stop keeping these feasts. You should know exactly where you are heading to. You are not heading to any pearly gates. Make sure Elijah's message goes past your head so that you enter in the pearly gates. Because we cannot enter the pearly gates with pagan feasts. We enter with God's feasts predicted to come. In Malachi chapter 4 verse 4 to 6, that they will come under the prophet, the ministry of Elijah the prophet, before the great and dreadful day, to make sure you and I are ready to jump on the kingdom, to jump on the pearly gates with the proper worship which is being done by all the universe, all the sinless planets, and the heaven itself has got it. We are going to continue. Let's go to now in our Malachi, and then the one that we are reading Malachi chapter 4 verse 4 to 5. We saw he will send Elijah the prophet before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. I'll introduce it so that we finish it off next week. Introduce the work now of Elijah, the proof that we should worship God according to his design. Let's go to this quotation, HST, February 5, 1845, page 202, sixth paragraph. If you are not in love with the New State, get in love with it now and go into the quotations as we read and find out and exhume all the things that have been hidden beyond. And we have been given all these creeds and policies to exclude these gems which will make us shine in the kingdom. But let's hear in the verse, Malachi, right?
In this verse, a caution is given to remember the laws, statutes, and judgments that were given to Moses on Mount Horeb for all Israel.
Right?
These laws were many of them, if not all, typical of the restoration of the things which our antitypical Elijah would restore on Mount Zion, the people and city of the living God, and to the whole house of the redeemed Israel out of all nations.
We are seeing from the spiritual prophets that these laws are the syllabus of Elijah to restore to the people who are supposed to be saved on Mount Zion. Stand on Mount Zion with the 144,000 with the lamp. The 144,000 will stand with the lamp because of the laws of Malachi 4, verse 4 to 5. The statutes, the judgments, the commandments, the testimonies, all a syllabus coming with Elijah. Whatever syllabus you have there, wherever you are, which one is your syllabus? Is it the syllabus for Elijah? Better grab on the moment to look for the syllabus of Elijah, if you actually know it is the last days. Because that's what we find in Matthew 24, verse 14. It says, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in many nations for a sign and for a witness. And the earth, Christ will come to reap. We are hearing it now, brethren. We are. For me to start on the work of Elijah and all these statutes and judgments, it will take me another period, and I know you are exhausted for now, and I know with what we have been saying since morning, those who need to be saved will be saved. They've heard where we are coming from and where we are going. They've heard what entails the worship of God. How is God worshipped? Is it anyhow? Is it with fables? He is worshipped with the 4 laws. As long as the 4 laws are there in your life, they will give you all that God gave them for. Gave them so that you are preserved alive. Gave them so that you fear Him. Gave them so that you find pleasure in living, and your life is worth living. You and I cannot afford to miss these laws and let them go by our neighbors. Watch your neighbors being blessed while you remain not blessed. Let's have this syllabus from Elijah in the last minute, so that when Christ comes, we'll hope in the kingdom. May God bless you, so that you continue in Elijah's message, is my prayer.